Okay, so it's my great honour to introduce this afternoon's plenary speaker, who is a world-leading scientist. It's Professor Jens Krause from Humboldt University in Berlin. Jens, as I say, is a world-leading scientist. If you don't want H-index envy, don't look at his Google Scholar entry. Well, I'll tell you anyway, it's an H-index of 59. An incredibly impressive array of publications. He's at Humboldt University, he's Professor of Fish Biology, but that doesn't really capture the variety of things that he does. Before going to Humboldt University, he spent 13 years at Leeds University, where he sort of ascended extremely rapidly from postdoc to Professor of Behavioural Ecology within a 13-year period. And during this time, he developed the research that he's become extremely well known for in two main areas, really, one being social networks and the other being collective behaviour. And both of these, of course, are areas that are of fundamental sort of comparative interest. Although Jens spends most of his time working on non-human species, he also has done some work on humans, but more particularly he's developing theoretical concepts in these areas that have very broad application comparatively. And today Jens is going to be speaking to us about his work on collective behaviour and the interesting links between collective behaviour and collective cognition. So over to you, Jens.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to a human behavior and evolution conference. And I have been to a number of meetings before that were focused on human behavior, but they were all organized by physicists and mathematicians. And so this meeting is sort of very different from my perspective in that there's so many psychologists and sociologists, human health experts here, and so on. And it's already been a great learning experience for me. And I'm very impressed with the boldness with which people attack these big picture questions. And I'm afraid that a lot of the questions I will raise in my talk are a lot smaller and a lot more specialized. But I hope that you will nevertheless find this kind of work interesting. I was trained as a biologist working on animals, and so studying human behavior is a relatively recent departure for my research group. And this really resulted from the collective behavior models that we developed, which made very broad predictions that went way beyond what we can test in animals, and made us very curious about human behavior. And like the first things that interested us were basic questions like, how do humans behave in public space? How do human crowds move? How do people cross roads? How do they applaud when they heard a talk? Is this predicted by sort of contagion models that we know from disease spreading, or are there other dynamics underlying this kind of behavior? And to my great surprise, I could not find answers to these questions, or not the kind of answers I was looking for in the textbooks. And so these are the kind of things we started with. So collective behavior, we can find this in many different systems, obviously in human crowds, in aquatic systems, and here in these bird flocks, these beautiful starlings. And the question is, how do they actually do this? I mean, it looks really fascinating. I can watch stuff like this for hours. And it raises this question, what does the individual starling actually do when it's flying in this big group? And usually this is broken down into three simple interactive components. So the animals are attracted to each other to form a group in the first place. And once they've come fairly close, they often align and they face in a similar direction. And to avoid collision, they feel repelled from each other when they come very close. So in a way, you are demonstrating some of these principles already. You are aligned because there's a central screen, so we wouldn't call that a self-organized collective behavior. But for instance, the fact that very few of you are touching at the moment. Humans also, well, there are some exceptions, but humans also like to have a bit of space around them. We could also talk about sort of the functions why animals like to organize in this way, but I want to focus on the mechanisms here. And this goes back to work with Ian Cousin years ago, and these metric models of collective behavior. So we have an individual represented here as an arrow in the center. Then there is the zone of repulsion immediately around it, a zone of orientation, and a zone of attraction. And the trick here is that each individual only interacts with a very limited number of near neighbors in its group or flock or whatever. And they basically do what they want to do, but they also compromise with what others nearby are currently doing. And this is sufficient to organize an entire group so that they can show directed locomotion. And in this type of model that I show here, I should mention these models didn't actually start in '92, they go even further back. But these particular models here, they are metric because we are looking at near neighbors within a certain metric distance in space. Later on, people added topological models, Andrea Cavagna's research group. So there you are not looking whether somebody maybe within 5 meters of me does something that I will take into account. You could just say, I look at my 4 nearest neighbor, no matter how far away they are. And that's indeed what the starlings do in that video I showed you. They pay attention to the 6, 7 nearest neighbor, whether they're very close or a bit further away. And then, well, I called these neurobiological models. You could really give this very different kinds of names. These are models that take more biological realism into account, the fact that if you want to take somebody's behavior into account, you have to be able to see that person. The person should not be occluded by somebody who is standing in between. So somebody could be very close to me, nevertheless I don't see that person. So you take into account what information actually reaches the retina, how is it represented, and then how does an animal sort of process and filter this information, and how does this result in behavioral action. Yeah, and then finally, or I shouldn't say finally, I mean this one could continue with this even longer, but one of the major recent steps was also the introduction of predictive models by Mehdi Moussaid and co-authors. Again, adding more biological realism, and in a way very surprising that it took so long, because they looked at the ability of agents to predict what happens at time t+1. And all of us do this every day when we walk through human crowds. You can predict where a gap will be opening up before it's actually there. It's very trivial. I mean, you can see on what trajectory other people are, and you predict what will happen. But this requires prediction, so you would not get this from necessarily from a simple metric model here like this one, where you just have sort of repulsion and attractive forces. There's no prediction in that. So in a way you can see that this started off as a very sort of very much a physics model, and then it became gradually a more biological approach. Anyway, what can we do with these kind of models? Well, initially we tried to first of all recapture many things we had already seen in nature. It was very satisfying to see that it can reproduce certain types of collective behaviors that we see in the natural world. But we also wanted to predict stuff, and one of the earliest things was how many individuals do you actually need to guide a group. And in the simulation we explored quite a bit of parameter space here, going from 10 to 200 individuals. And these individual leaders, they all have the same directional preference. And it turns out you only need 5 to 10 of those to guide groups with very high accuracy to a target. We had expected that the number of leaders needed would go up dramatically as group size increases, but this turns out not to be the case. Now, you can simulate lots of things, of course, but the importance is to test it. And initially I had in mind for John Dyer, my PhD student at the time, to test this with fish. And so the fact that we started working on humans was actually also quite accidental, to be honest. Because I wanted him to train small sticklebacks to swim right and left in a big tank and to have preferences, and then to mix them with naive individuals that don't have preferences, and then to work out how many fish you need to guide a school. But it turned out that these fish were very hard to train. Okay, and John despaired over this, and it was the beginning of his PhD, and I didn't want this to start with a huge frustration. So we decided to use our undergraduate students for this experiment, and we instructed them to walk at normal walking speed and to remain within arm's length of each other. So basically it was so convenient that you can give humans rules. It turned out that the not talking, not gesturing part was a lot harder for them to do, but they managed that as well. Then we put them here in the center of this arena. Can you actually see my cursor? Oh, great. Okay, and then they can move around also beyond this arena. And of course the trick is that one or several people get private information. They were meant to go to a particular location, but without leaving the group. It's quite tricky to do this. You want to go somewhere, but you shouldn't separate from the rest. And we were very surprised to see how good people are at this kind of thing. So compared to no leader being present, they can guide the group with great precision to a target. But this was done here with very small groups of 8 or 10 people. And then the challenge came when we did this with very large groups of people, hundreds. I mean, the ambition was to really predict how we can guide crowds. And here we see an experiment where we have 10 leaders and a group of 200. These 10 individuals have the same target, but they don't know of each other or that anybody has a target at all. And the 190 other ones, they don't know that leaders are present here in this experiment. So they think they're just going for a walk in this hall. And so you can see in the video here, the leaders quickly accumulate here at the front, and then they initiate a movement here in this direction towards the target location. So this worked quite well with 5% of the group. And if we dramatically reduce the number of leaders, they could not do it anymore. And of course, if you use more, you can cut down on the time. And then, of course, you have a control. So here there are no leaders present. So these people just walk and they stay within arm's length. And yeah, to our surprise, they formed this kind of ring structure here. This thing has interesting properties. It shows concentric circles, so there's spontaneous lane formation in different directions. Many individual people tried to break the torus. There were spontaneous laughter when they realized they were kind of caught in this structure, but they couldn't break it. It can actually break down occasionally, then reforms again. It's a very dynamic structure, which you can see also from this graph here. Once it forms, the diameter of the torus can fluctuate. It can enclose objects in the hall. And this is here the center of the torus, and this thing can also go through the entire building, basically. So a fairly complex looking structure coming from very simple interactions. And then, of course, inevitably conflict. So we wanted to see if 20 people head this way and 10 the other way, what will happen. Well, in most of our experiments, the majority won this kind of thing. They would bring everybody to their target. In this particular run here, this actually never stabilized. They kept fluctuating. We didn't put the targets far away enough from each other to really force them into a stable choice. But yeah, I mean, the outcome, if you put them far apart enough, is that the majority can get everybody over to their preferred side, and there will be a consensus decision without any kind of discussion. So when you talk to these participants, they usually have no idea that they were being led in any way in this experiment. They don't really seem to notice the presence of leaders. Of course, we pick these people randomly, whether they're a leader or a naive person in this experiment. We found a slight sort of advantage for tall people to lead because they are obviously seen better in the crowd. But other than that, we didn't pick up many characteristics that make people better leaders than others. And we confirm more or less the prediction of the simulation that we only need a very small proportion of people for this kind of thing. So once we had these kind of results, we were contacted by a surprising number of people who were interested in applications. I hadn't really expected this. We did this really mostly to test our simulations and so on, but then a lot of architects and people who do urban planning and also the police contacted us, and they wanted answers to questions like could you predict where to place knowledgeable individuals in a crowd to maximize the efficiency of evacuations from buildings or public squares? And we then did a number of experiments on this, which I don't want to show in detail now. But they also wanted us to try and predict the outbreak of violence at demonstrations and so on, to test whether this follows similar principles, that small percentages of people come with the intention of being violent and then get bystanders to copy and so on. It's very interesting stuff, but we didn't go too deeply into the latter part for a number of reasons. I think it's quite clear from tragic events of the recent past that understanding human crowds will probably become increasingly important in the future for a number of reasons. I mean, the population densities are increasing and event culture is on the rise and so on. So the risks for people when they are in large crowds are severe in some cases, and we can see here the increase in tragic crowd events over the years. And we published a number of papers on the details of how human crowds function and so on. And in conversations with Dirk Helbing's group, who have been working on this for a lot longer than we have, we then decided to put together this article in 2014 to explain how this kind of complexity science could actually, or how these insights could be used to really save human lives, because our perception was that we were publishing these papers with a lot of modeling and mathematics, and that they weren't actually read by the decision makers who should know about these kind of things. So by politicians, event organizers, managers, and so on. And so we made a catalog of all the kind of criteria that we believe would keep people safe in public spaces. And Dirk Helbing has gone even further and applied some of this in Mecca, for instance, where they installed automated cameras that can assess densities per square meter. So you get normal laminar flow when you have sort of below 2 people per square meter. Once you have 2 or 3, you get stop and go behavior. Once you have more than 4 per square meter, you get turbulences and shock waves. These kind of things you can pick up with computer vision and get early warning. So this would be just one example of how you would use insights from this kind of research to make public life safer. Yeah, here another example of trying to understand human behavior. So when we did these experiments, giving humans rules, I found was a bit frustrating. They often don't follow them, and they do other things. We also had journalists participating in our public experiments, trying to hijack them. And so we decided to observe humans in the wild here in a study where we looked at road crossing. And we wanted to understand, how do people do this when the light is red for the pedestrians, so here green for the cars, and then some people cross nevertheless. Others cross too, and a very, very basic question here is, do they follow this first person, or do they independently assess the situation and then decide to cross as well? And the reason I became interested in this was, it's such a simple decision. I mean, you have this short waiting time, or you cross quickly, but you have a major risk that you are taking, and it's a behavior that everybody engages in. So that made it interesting to us. We had a null model here, which you see here, the independent behavior. So one person starts, and then the starting order of the rest is more or less random here. And then we have this kind of situation. You start, and then your near neighbor will feel compelled to, or will have a raised probability to start as well. And I think we all know it's it's the second one that we observe very frequently. So there is a very strong influence on people nearby, and we quantified this. So people nearby are about twice as likely to start crossing when a leader next to them begins. We didn't find differences in men and women with regards to who crosses first, but once there was an individual crossing, men were faster to copy this and expose themselves to this risk. Another aspect of this work was also that I realized that until the very end I had not really fully understood why these people were following, because you see people in this wave, these people here at the very end. If you take enough video footage of this kind of thing, you do actually see people getting hit by cars. And we didn't see any life-threatening injuries, but we saw quite a few collisions. So people are taking serious risks. And when I observed this over a few weeks' time, I thought, man, I mean, these people, are they crazy? I mean, are they in such a hurry? Or, I mean, why are they doing this? And it was not until I packed up all the cameras and everything and walked back to the university, was in conversation to my PhD student, somebody next to me walked and I followed and I nearly got hit. That I realized what you do is when people start walking, you think, now it's green. It's time to safely cross. That is the assumption behind it. So I think a lot of these people are just trusting that this is the right thing to do at that moment, and it's clearly not. We saw a few cases actually of people copying, realizing that it's red, and they return, particularly in Germany, where you get fined if you get caught doing this. So in the UK it's all right. Yeah, I mean, some of the limitations of doing this kind of work on humans with rule following I mentioned already. Another one with the pedestrians was, I would have loved to investigate this, of course, experimentally, right? And put in people of my choice who then suddenly cross when the light is red and then instigate others to cross. But I mean, this would have been potentially at the cost of human life. So we obviously can't do experiments like this. And I was looking for a system that gives me greater flexibility. And so we did return to the fish and made a robotic one. And so the idea here was to make a small fish that looks to other fish, like a conspecific, maybe not to you, but to other fish, and that they're willing to engage with in social behavior. And then we can let this one do really dramatic things and watch what happens, okay? So we can program any kind of route for this thing, and then it will execute it. This is the tank at the Humboldt University where it lives. And if you open the gate, then it comes out. And you see it here, top-down view, sticklebacks, 3 centimeters. There should be 10 live fish and a robot. We make the robot go in a very robotic way to make it obvious what the robot is up to. And then he takes over. So if I had an open ocean application of this, I would be very rich by now. Unfortunately, I can only shepherd little sticklebacks back into a box so far. See how they move away from it. The moment it stops moving, it stops being interesting, okay? The other trick here is these fish have to be very newly introduced to the tank, so they don't know this environment. And then they respond very strongly to an individual that moves as if it had local information. If you leave the fish in there for a longer time and they have a lot of private information, they don't pay a lot of attention to each other anymore, and also not to the robot. Not so much. I mean, they still do, but it's decreased. Yeah, I want to show you a couple of experiments we did with Ashley Ward to explore these kind of interactions. So we release fish, they make a right-left choice, and the robot will go past a predator model here, something that the fish normally wouldn't do, or it tries to lead them away from a food source, which is also something we assume the fish would not normally do if they are not under the influence of a leader. And you can see here out of 20 trials, if we have 1, 2, 4, and 8 live fish, if there's no robot present, very rarely do they spontaneously go past the predator. However, 18 out of 20 did when a single robot went past the predator, so they follow very strongly. But we lose this influence when the groups are larger. So collectively they make a choice for the safe path. However, we can regain some control over them if we use multiple robots. And interestingly, you don't see a big effect from 2 to 3. So presumably already when 2 individuals independently demonstrate the same behavior, the fish begin to follow it. So the probability for this behavior to be shown in error is probably very low. A single fish can always be blind, but that 2 fish would be blind and swim in the same direction at the same time. It's probably very low, so the fish are willing to follow. So we see this evidence for quorum decisions here. A certain threshold is reached, and then they follow. Yeah, and then for the food, I want to show you also how the robot fails, of course. So it takes them to their favorite food, bloodworms. This fish here hesitates for a moment and then does the right thing, ignores the useless leader. And so that's a larger group ignoring a leader. And here we see the contrast between a small and a large group. And so there's quite a marked difference in their behavior. We developed a new robot in Berlin, primarily in collaboration with Tim Landgraf from the Free University and Pavel Romanchuk and David Bierbach. And I want to show you a few features of this new robot. First of all, the improved sort of leadership behavior that we can achieve now. Takes a moment here for the tracking system to get going. So we have the robot is here, live fish is here. Okay, now the tracking system has them. And here you can see how influential the robot is now. So we can do a lot of pretty crazy directional changes, and the fish keeps with a conspecific. It's in a new environment, then it's highly social. It wants to stay near a conspecific, and in this case, the robot simply leads. It doesn't make any compromises. And here you can see how strongly it can lead. So we have here 3 tracks of 3 different fish. In blue, what the robot does. In red, how the fish follows. And this is always relative to how a fish follows another live fish compared to how it, or I shouldn't say follows. This is simply here on the y-axis, time spent in proximity, okay, to a second live fish or to the robot. And you see that we have almost no difference anymore between how they respond to a live neighbor and a robotic neighbor. So we are getting pretty close now to having a very convincing conspecific. Okay, and then the last robotic video I want to show you is this one. So we have made this robot interactive now. That was much harder than the leadership. So it has to find the other fish in real time now, assess their positions, and then we have an algorithm that tells it what to do. For instance, this one is programmed to aim for the center of the group, which is a bit hard to see here because we used so few fish. But we can basically take any kind of algorithm of social behavior now, and the robot will embody it. So we could also, for instance, make a bold or a shy leader, a knowledgeable or a naive one, and then let it interact and look at information transmission or stage events of innovation or social learning using this kind of setup. Okay, but back to the very basics. We became interested in what potential costs of collective behavior and collective cognition could be. And we saw already the larger group of fish took the safer option when there was a risk, and they did not follow the robot. But do they potentially also pay costs for these kind of collective decisions? We investigated this using mosquito fish, and in this work, again with Ashley Ward, the fish pass down this corridor, make a right-left decision. There's a cryptic predator. We test up to 16 fish, and we first of all looked at the accuracy of the decision. So a single fish was a very poor decision maker. It often went down the arm with a cryptic predator. It was not very good at detecting it, even though this should be particularly important to that fish when it's alone to avoid the predator. And we see that they are extremely good at this when they are in large groups. Now that's the kind of thing we've known for a long, long time. Actually, there are already papers from the 1970s showing the sort of many eyes effect of bird flocks. So the big question here was, do they take more time for making these excellent decisions? And as you all know, in humans, collective decision making, particularly collective cognition, discussions and so on, are usually associated with enormous time costs. And the big surprise was that in the fish, the reverse is true. So as group size goes up, the actual time needed for the decision goes down. So this means they make not only better, they also make faster decisions in larger groups. So it was the opposite of what we had expected, as a double advantage then to being in groups. And we believe it has something to do with the problem of multitasking here for individuals when they swim down this corridor and they come to the end of the corridor here. We find that they do actually look right and left, This is pretty unusual in a fish because they can see right and left anyway, of course, having the eyes on the side of the body. But they seem to be doing this also to estimate distances, so to get a bifocal look into each corridor. And they were so busy in some cases that they had collisions with the barriers. So obviously these fish are having a hard time making decisions when they are alone, but not when they're in a group. They don't seem to deviate at all from a straight line of swimming down the corridor. And this is probably something to do with the fact that when they swim in a group, a lot of space is occluded by bodies, and so they only see a relatively small part of the space right in front of them. And for this, they can make an almost perfect decision that can then be communicated in the group. Yeah, after doing these experiments and also some others on other study systems, including humans and so on, we tried to come up with some characteristics of what we might want to call collective cognition. And so this involves the ability to independently acquire information in your environment and to process this through social interaction, or in some cases, humans also replace this interaction by an algorithm, for instance, if we forecast things for the future. And then this should solve a cognitive problem in a way that cannot be implemented by a single individual. So when these things are in place, collective cognition, these things characterize collective cognition. So as soon as we had published this kind of work, Larissa Conrad came up with an idea, or I should say a weakness of our work. So she said, you only looked at half the decision, or half the problem really, how the fish detect a predator when it's really present. And how often do the fish, for instance, swim away when there's actually no predator present? You didn't measure that in your experiment, and maybe that is the real cost of collective decision making, and not the fact that it might take longer. So this was, of course, really annoying. I wish Larissa had told me that before over coffee and not waited until I fall into this trap and publish this. But we had a number of good discussions about this, and from being really annoyed, I came to see it as a brilliant insight, and we tried to work on this. And so we looked at this kind of situation where you have fish on the bottom of a stream, they are foraging on something they have discovered, and suddenly they notice a shadow. And this could be a kingfisher, a predatory bird that might try to get them, or it could be a harmless butterfly of the same size. In Trinidad, where this picture was taken, the butterflies are the size of birds, so this is really possible. How do they distinguish these two? Okay, this is not trivial. So we have the true and the false positive here, and it's a tricky thing. I mean, if I become more sensitive to shadows, then I will avoid more kingfishers, but I will show more false positives to butterflies. And if I say I don't really care so much about shadows, well, I will avoid almost all false positives, but my risk of getting taken by the kingfisher is higher. So I can sort of up and down regulate this. But what I really want is, of course, for my true positive to be very high and for my false positive to be very low, ideally 0. And we thought, this could be an interesting problem for collective cognition. And I worked on this with Max Wolf, a theoretician in our department, and with Ralf Köbers, a postdoc at the time. By now he runs his own research group. And we thought, okay, I mean, if there is a true positive rate and if there is a false positive rate, maybe it would be possible then for decision makers to put a quorum threshold in between these two, so that they would only leave this area if Q% want to leave and otherwise they stay. And to place this or to recognize this quorum should become easier as group size becomes larger, because to recognize a fraction, let's in this case here 45%, becomes of course easier when the group is larger. Okay, so what do you do with something like that? Again, I mean, you try it out on data. And we explored a number of animal systems. We could have, of course, done this with a fish, and indeed we have to a certain extent, but I don't want to show this now. But we really went data hunting. That was quite exciting. So we wrote to airport security staff and to medical doctors and to people who have lie detector data, all the people who have these kind of binary data where this kind of decision rule might apply. And the most exciting of those, to us at least, was the case of the doctors. So if a doctor is faced by a patient, then there are cues available for the decision, okay? So if I have a brown mark on my arm and I think this might be skin cancer, I go to the doctor. Doctor will see this, and then if it's a true positive and the doctor says, yes, you need to be treated, and yes, the disease turns out to be present, or it's a false positive and I get treatment, but the disease was actually absent. So the doctor has to make this decision based on imperfect information. And we thought, okay, I mean, this could be interesting. And we were offered a very large data set from the US, from the Knight Cancer Center. And this is on breast cancer, which accounts for the largest percentage of new cancer cases in the US. And mammography is the most common screening technique for this. And it's usually carried out by a single radiologist. That was crucial for us. We wanted to look at collective decision making. So for us, it was very interesting to know that it's normally done by a single person, the diagnosis. And they do make errors, okay? So here we see, I mean, 20%. That's a substantial error rate. So a single person making decisions and making mistakes. So that was the starting position for us. And we were given this very interesting data set where many doctors, 101, had been shown many of these pictures, and then they had to rate them, whether breast cancer was present or not. And the true status of each mammogram was known. So thereby we could evaluate how good these doctors actually are. And we then selected from these doctors' assessments a certain number of opinions here of group size n. So we take maybe 3 opinions from 3 different doctors, and then we subject this to a very simple decision rule. So majority would be here the most simple. If 2 doctors say no and 1 yes, then we would say no treatment. Okay, and if 2 say yes and 1 no, then it's the opposite. And quorum I already explained to you. So we would set a threshold between the true and false positive, and to establish those true and false positive rates, of course, we have to go through a training data set. And you can also do weighted quorums. So you look at performance data of these individual doctors. You see how good they are over time, and you will find differences in their ability, and then you can give higher weighting to doctors with higher ability in these decisions. Yeah, and then you always compare this to the best doctor for a given group size, and you see whether you can beat him or her. And that's exactly what we did. You see the data here at the top, the true positive, and down here the false positives. In green, the best doctor from that group size, and then our collective cognition algorithms played against this. And you can see already for fairly small group sizes, they can comfortably beat the best doctors, and if you look at overall accuracy, then this is already substantially improved for groups of 3. And in this case, it's the weighted quorum that comes out top. But this depends also a little on how you play with the weightings and so on. Yeah, and then we had a second data set on skin cancer. In a way, for us, this was an even more interesting data set because doctors are using these checklists. They look at different specific criteria to assess these cancers, and different doctors are good at different types of criteria. So in addition to simply group size, one could potentially also look at what kind of diversity of doctors we want to have. So we could look at group composition and group size. The data I show you now are simply for group size, but we are continuing to work on this. And it shows a very similar story here. We see the blue doctor is our best individual, and again beaten by these collective intelligence algorithms. Okay, so from this, we concluded that this kind of decision-making rule can be used to improve the diagnosis of these cancers in patients. It would, of course, be more expensive to get these additional opinions, so it's a bit a question also of what it's worth to have these better decisions. Undoubtedly, this will also save money because wrong diagnoses will involve costs. Apart from the human welfare consideration. We can see that the majority rule performs well, but the quorum rule has, of course, a lot more flexibility. We can even use the quorum in situations where 50% or more of the doctors get it wrong. The majority rule, of course, you can only apply if the majority of doctors is usually right for the diagnosis. So that's already a prerequisite going into this kind of thing. And the quorum approach also allows you a different weighting of true and false positives. As you all know, doctors would normally try and maximize the true positive rather than maximize reducing the false positive. And we have also started exploring other areas of medical decision making where collective decision rules could potentially make a contribution. So in the local hospital in Berlin, in the Charité, we have started collaborating with doctors to see what other areas we could target next. There's also plenty of potential to take this kind of thing further, in the sense that you can use computer vision algorithms, of course, to detect certain types of patterns in pictures, and then you can again sort of look at how many different algorithms you want to get some kind of diversity and uncorrelated error to make better decisions. And there have also been, of course, attempts at training lay people, especially in the context of the skin cancer, for them to recognize some of these criteria. Their opinions would, of course, be a lot cheaper. So you could ask more people for the same money. Whether you have the same trust in the ultimate decision is, of course, a different matter altogether. Okay, I see that I still have some time, and I know that these plenary talks are always normally meant to be well-rounded talks in which you try to show how you've figured everything out. But I want to actually show you something at the end of my talk that absolutely puzzles me, and I want to end with an open question. And this is also something on collective behavior, of course, is related to this question of true and false positives. And it's something I will be working on in 2 weeks' time in Mexico, together with a large group of empiricists and theoreticians, mainly David and Pavel leading the two groups. And before this thing starts, what we see here is a pond in southern Mexico. It's very shallow water, and there are tiny fish in this. They're about 20 millimeters in size, and this pond is maybe 40, 50 meters across. And the fish are primarily at the surface. I will explain in a moment why. And we now throw a little stone into this water. And what fish normally do when this kind of thing happens, so this would simulate the attack of a kingfisher, you will see a fright wave, okay? The fish going away from the stimulus, and you see a fright wave, and then usually there is silence again. And so let's see what these guys do here. So a stone goes in. You saw the initial fright wave. That's already gone now. And each of these waves goes over about 10 meters, so involving tens of thousands of individual fish, okay? And see how the waves become actually, how they develop. And how many there are of them. So this continues for quite a while. And so we were absolutely astonished when we saw this for the first time. And this is for a number of reasons. First of all, we do not understand why the fish keep going for a long, long time. And as you can see, they actually save the biggest waves for last. I mean, this is building up. And also the fact of the numbers of individuals involved. It's a lattice of fish at the surface. And the sheer number of waves and their size. And we were wondering about the kind of contagion model that we need to explain this kind of behavior, okay? And I first of all want to give you a little bit of background on the fish that create this kind of phenomenon, because they're very, very special in a way. This is an endemic fish that is only found in this region. They live in the sulfur water, and no other vertebrates can live in this water. In fact, we have to wear gas masks when we work there. And so they have no predators in the water itself. But it also means there is virtually no oxygen in the water. So they have to be for almost the entire time at the surface. And I mean, you can see here, I don't know, at the back it might be difficult, but we get about 1,000 and more fish per square meter. And these are the size distributions and the part of Mexico where we observed this. Yeah, and as I mentioned, most of the oxygen is gone from the water, and there is also a conversion of hemoglobin, so that causes additional problems for these fish. And it leads also to an inactivation of COX protein, which is vital for generating ATP. So a number of bad effects of the sulfur in the water, and I don't want you to look at the details here. This is just to give an overview. A number of excellent scientists have been working on this system for quite some time, including people like Tobler and Schlupp and Bierbach and Fenninger and so on, evolutionary biologists, and they were interested in the adaptations of these fish, how they can survive here, so they have larger heads for processing water at the surface. They spend 84% of their time at the surface, and their COX proteins are already quite resistant to this sulfur water, and they can deal with these conditions much better. And so the result of being so much at the surface is that bird predation is huge. So these fish get absolutely hammered by birds. The birds are there all the time. The fish can dive down very quickly, then immediately they have to come up again, and the birds are waiting there for this, okay? And this was really intriguing to see that they have no underwater predation and only surface predation. And so what these fish do is they go down and up and down and up. And this is what is causing the waves that you see. And one of the questions we were wondering about, of course, why so many? I mean, if they can dive many times after one another, couldn't they just stay down for longer once? I mean, why even come up? We see no difference we see no lengthening in the surface intervals, which you would expect if the fish is getting increasingly oxygen starved. But the major waves are actually very, very regular. And we have been looking at other models for waves, like the Farkas model for the Mexican waves in football stadia. So ours is also a truly Mexican wave, as we saw it in Mexico. But you're probably familiar with these people sit and then they get up and then they sit down again. And this has been nicely modeled. And one of the questions, is this sufficient to explain, mechanistically what the fish do? We still wouldn't quite understand from this model why they do it so many times. And I just finish with these some of these questions. Another thing that really puzzles us about the system is that they're so incredibly good at avoiding false positives. So if you have hundreds of thousands of these fish at the surface, we would expect all the time that there are small ripples, i.e. false positives that then die out. And we don't see that, okay? These fish are hypersensitive, and at the same time, they don't seem to make a lot of errors. And we wonder, how do they actually do that? And I leave you with that open question, and would like to acknowledge all the collaborators, the biological-minded empirical people and theoreticians on one side, the medics on the other, and all the funding support. And I thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Jens, for a really fascinating and incredibly diverse talk, from robot fish to mammograms and what have you. So we've got time for maybe one question, depending on the length of the exchange.
Well, you started with that interesting experiment with your graduate students or humans, but you told them all to stay within an arm length of each other. So my question is, well, what do people do naturally? I should think that's what you would really want to know for the crowd and all the empirical applications and so on.
Yeah, I mean, the trick there is they only have to stay within arm's length of another person, one other person. So it doesn't mean they have to stay with a crowd or anything. So of course, when they do this, you can very easily get dyads or triplets separating and so on. So it does not mean that you get cohesion necessarily. We are not coding for cohesion in the whole crowd. That is how it starts. The other thing is, you would actually see when you look at, train stations and so on, of course, quite a few single travelers as well, but many people are organized in smaller groups or responding to people nearby. So I think a certain amount of response to nearby people is actually something that you do observe. And you can, of course, then also do these kind of experiments in more natural settings where you take people who are not quite decided on their actual walking direction, and you experimentally put some people at the front of the group, for instance, and make a right-left decision or something, where you haven't given these people actual rules. You just see to which extent you can deviate their path in a predicted direction. So I haven't shown all of these experiments. There's basically a continuum. I showed you the sort of hardcore start of it, where we put a lot of rules, and then you gradually relax more and more of these rules that they have to stay together and so on, and then you can play a lot with these parameters, also how fast they walk, or you can say keep 5 arms lengths or 10, you know, and you see that the results are robust. But I think I should probably...
Okay, yeah, I think we better move on. Thank you very much, and I'm sure there'll be lots more questions after this.